Hello again, everyone. Here we are today to discuss the interwar years and rise of totalitarianism, which could also be titled or subtitled The Origins of World War II. And our class gets increasingly grim from this point, since all we have left is the origins of World War II, this unit, and our next one on the shooting part of World War II, the actual combat. Sorry to end the class on a low note, but I didn't make the history. The world did. So we're talking about, in this unit here, the 1920s and the 1930s, post-World War I, pre-World War II. And as I'm sure you know, the two wars are connected in certain ways, centering usually on the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll have time to get to. But nonetheless, the word totalitarianism, this is going to loom large here, so we need to get some sort of grip on that. So the time frame is the 20s and the 1930s, interwar years, and though we're talking about mostly the grim stuff because we kind of have to, it dominates, do keep in mind that in the 20s and 30s, especially before it became clear, and it wasn't clear to everyone right up until the very end, that the world would descend into another, even more destructive, in fact far more destructive war, known as World War II. So even in Germany, we'll see, there are certain aspects of the culture and the time and society that weren't all about Nazis. The Nazis were rising to power in the 1920s, and in the first half or more of that decade, they were a presence, but not a dominant presence on the German domestic landscape. So, totalitarianism. Well, this is total control, or the attempt at total control, by an authoritarian government. And this goes beyond absolute monarchy, something we started the class with. It's kind of a absolute monarchy on steroids, one could say, to put it very crudely, of course. But certainly Louis XIV and Frederick the Great, another absolute monarch, Peter the Great, absolute monarchs of the 17th and 18th centuries, were trying to control as much as possible, but they couldn't. Part of it was lack of technology, organizational, institutional sophistication, hadn't gotten that far yet. But I don't think there was quite the same will here, because now controlling other people is not just sort of part of how you govern if you're an absolute monarch or you want to govern. It's part of an overarching ideology and belief that the common good is being served, and the common good trumps the individual good in a totalitarian system, and for the better of everybody. That there's somewhere in the future, a perfect future waiting for us if we all just sort of get together, work as a collective whole towards achieving the promised land, whatever version of the promised land is being sold and believed. The leaders themselves oftentimes are true believers in such goals. So totalitarianism forces the individual to give up their individual goals and rights in order to work towards the betterment or the achievement of the goals of the collective. And it does so coercively. It tries to indoctrinate and convince, cajole, but also coerce to the point of extreme, frightening violence at the same time. So the attempt at total control and the tendency for it to get pretty close to it is evidenced by one thing in particular. Excuse me. I'll just use this as an example. So, in at least free societies that aren't totalitarian, there's something that we refer to as civil society. If you haven't come across this phrase, you stay in school long enough, you probably will. And civil society has a simple definition. It's really kind of any organization or organizations, institutions that exist outside of government or kind of outside of official channels. So in a broad sense, it would include even large corporations, since they're not government, but it tends to mean something a little more circumscribed than that, which are kind of local organizations. So things that are outside of government at the local level, like churches, clubs. Today it'd be like fitness clubs, tennis clubs, but also knitting clubs, reading clubs, sort of music clubs, the Elks Lodge. All of these things would be part of civil society, and I think it's pretty clear that historically speaking, these have been, in a way, the lifeblood of culture, the lifeblood of community. People get together. Human beings are social animals, and we usually have to do so at the local level. And these are the types of organizations that people have flocked to. And historians, sociologists look at societies, and when they see a lack of civil society, a lack of these type of local institutions, they usually tend to also, alongside that, and partly because of it, see an unhealthy and sort of degraded cultural life. Well, what do totalitarian systems and governments say about such clubs and do about them? They eradicate them. They eliminate them completely, totally. Study, say, Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc countries under Soviet control, Czechoslovakia and others, Poland, during the Cold War. And that's what the Soviet government did to those countries, although it did it to its own people, at home in Russia and the Soviet Union as well. And I mean literally. You weren't allowed to have a reading club. You weren't allowed to have a club where everybody sort of came and brought their instruments and had a band on your own. There were official government clubs that you could join, where you could go and play music and be part of a band, but nothing unofficial outside of government, nothing in the realm of civil society. Totalitarian governments try to, and often succeed, at crushing civil society. Although I shouldn't say they succeed, because there's always underground clubs that form. But they're dangerous because people can get arrested, and do, and sometimes maybe even killed for daring to have something as innocuous as a macrame club. And I'm exaggerating only slightly, but you see, totalitarian systems don't want to leave anything to chance. They're afraid that anything outside of the government that's being done privately, with two or more people getting together, could be a conspiracy. That's at least at the most extreme. So they're somewhat afraid, well, if we allow these private organizations to develop, behind our backs, in secret, they might be plotting against us. But it's worse than that. What they're really afraid of, what they're really trying to stamp out, is anybody's loyalty to anything else but the government, but the system, but sort of the ultimate totalitarian goal, whatever it might be. Perfect communism in the Soviet Union, the supreme rule of the master race in the case of Nazi Germany, the belief that they were superior and needed to do and win mortal combat with all other races. So they're so intent upon obtaining and maintaining total control that they eliminate civil society, any kind of private organization, not as much because they're afraid it could be a rallying point for a coup or a revolution, but simply because it takes people's attention for however short amount of time per day, per week, away from the ultimate goal, which apparently is the only goal, and that is what the government, what the totalitarian system has in store for you and your family and your community. So it really does try to sort of get rid of any sense of and reality to independent community outside of government goals. I think that's the erasing of civil society is the best example that I've ever thought of, at least if I have to pick one example of what a totalitarian system is like, for those who have to live under it, who experience it. So how did all this happen? How do we go from pre-World War I, the gradual move, at least in Western Europe and other places, somewhat so, towards liberal democracy, to an increasing number of totalitarian systems, which include fascism, Nazism, communism, etc., etc. We're going to explore that, of course. So Europe was not exactly set up to succeed after World War I, partly because of the Versailles Treaty. I told you I'd get back to it, and the consequences, of the entire way that the peace process or peace conference in Paris went down in 1919. John Maynard Keynes, who you see pictured here, a renowned British economist who was kind of on his way up at the time, was attached to the British delegation to Paris in 1919 as an economist, a young up-and-coming intellectual, and an advisor then to David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, one of the big four at the conference. Sometimes it can be misleading when we talk about the Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George and the other leaders at the conference, and think that sort of just those guys showed up. But President Wilson, for instance, went across the Atlantic to that conference by ship, couldn't go by plane in those days, with hundreds of people, accountants and lawyers and bureaucrats and economists, etc., because this is a global conference about how to put the world together, again, after a world war. So Keynes was just one of many attached to the British delegation, but he was pretty prominent, even though he was sort of fairly young, up and coming. But he quit in disgust in the middle of the process because he believed that Lloyd George and the British government as a whole was taking the wrong approach. One could say that in some ways he agreed with Woodrow Wilson, who didn't want to impose a punishing peace on Germany, which is exactly what Britain and France, their leaders, wanted to do. He was at odds with the leadership and quit, and wrote what became a famous essay, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in 1919. He says in that work, which became famous, but who can say how much is endurable or in what direction men will seek at last to escape from their misfortunes? So there are other arguments that he makes, and not all of it ends up, I think, being totally convincing, at least now. At the time it may have been more, but some of it does, because he is saying here in this passage, and it's certainly a theme, a point that he makes in the essay, that we're just shooting ourselves in the foot if we punish Germany economically, because it's an integrated economy, world economy already. So if we harm the German economy, we're harming our own economy. And by imposing this harsh peace that's already embittered Germans, we just make it more likely that it's going to boomerang back on us, and there'll be another war of aggression in the future. So Keynes certainly hit on something with this, and this is just my way of kind of getting us to have a wedge to sort of get into the idea of the Versailles Treaty and its connecting link, or it being a connecting link between the two world wars. Remember that all Germans were bitter before the ink was even dry on the Treaty of Versailles about its results. Germans didn't think that they had caused the war. They didn't even think they had lost the war. They thought they were sold out by their leaders, not Hindenburg and von Ludendorff, or Hindenburg and Ludendorff, as would actually have been true, but the leaders who they left sort of holding the bag after they took off, in utterly irresponsible fashion. But Germans didn't believe they'd lost the war. So now they're being blamed for a war that they thought they'd been railroaded on anyway. And we also know that historians, and their historians are right to think this, don't see the war as entirely Germany's fault. There's plenty of blame to go around. In our unit on the Great War, I mentioned that there are a handful of historians, prominent ones, who actually think other countries were more responsible than Germany. So no one that teaches or writes history believes that Germany was solely responsible. But nonetheless, the bitterness over the treaty in Germany, the hardship that it did cause, certainly helped to set up the next war and the next conflict. So Keynes was right about this. He wasn't the only one to see this possibility or likelihood, but this is a famous sort of offering, in that train of thought. Sorry, hear my wife and child outside my door. Another feature of interwar life was a group of writers, mainly American writers, at least that fall under the title of the Lost Generation. But they certainly have a great deal in common with writers in Europe in the post-war, interwar world. The tendency in writing fiction, novels, poetry, not surprisingly, was pessimism and despair. We know that was already somewhat the case even before World War I, for other reasons, but now it's this disastrous war, horrifying war, partly because there seemed to be no point to it, at least to most people. Mass slaughter for no reason whatsoever. Not that there ever is a good reason for mass slaughter, but there seemed to be no reason to many people here. And so this added to the sense of gloom and anxiety and despair after World War I. Gertrude Stein, who lived in Paris famously and became kind of a mentor to a lot of up-and-coming writers, again, most of them American, like Fitzgerald and Hemingway. But she said, as you see in the quote, "All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation. You have no respect for anything. You drink yourselves to death." That was certainly true. The last part, even of many of these writers, Hemingway and Fitzgerald are already kind of well known for it. But Erich Maria Remarque, the German writer, the man who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, he became sort of a big-time partier. He moved to the U.S. And sort of was lived kind of in the jet set crowd there. He's a good writer, but he lived a pretty wild life, maybe partially, that's what's assumed anyway, because of his experiences in World War I. Mark Mazauer, a known historian on this time period in Europe, in a great book called The Dark Continent, about these exact years, said the men who came home from the war carried the physical and mental scars of their experiences. They were destroyed men, incapable of reintegrating into civilian life, haunted by wartime memories. Many committed suicide, drank themselves into oblivion, or tried to reassert their authority by beating their wives and children. Mutilated veterans begged at street corners. There was much talk of youth running wild in a newly fatherless community. So that's being said rather dramatically there, but it's more or less true. We saw another quote from a writer who I used to talk about or tell us about trench warfare, life during trench warfare. That's somewhat similar to this, but there certainly was an added, right? It was already there, but now there's an added sort of element of anxiety, pessimism, and despair, a tendency to now look askance at Enlightenment values, reason, science, etc. It lasts into the 1920s, into the interwar year. There are lots of signs of irrational political and social effects on Europe after World War I. Now, immediately after the war, liberal democracy seemed to be kind of snapped back into place, and partly because such democracies were created, at least in form, at the Versailles or Paris Peace Conference. But by the end of the decade, certainly into the 1930s and the Great Depression, liberal democracy starts to decline, and in some ways you could see say it was a delayed reaction to World War I, which is a hard thing to prove, but nonetheless, I still think there's enough signs of it to make the case that that is so. World War I looked like... Yes?